This video is sponsored by World Anvil. I've always loved looking at fantasy maps, imagining what could be living in the mountain peaks or dark forests. This is how I build my worlds. One location, creature, person at a time. Now, I can take those people and places and bring them to life. Each one gets an article, a description, and most importantly, loot. I love being able to write the backstory of the town my players are in for them to read at their leisure, or sneak plot devices into the mayor's description. The impact on my games has been incredible. The best part? It's so easy to use. If you're looking for inspiration on how to get started, check out some of the worlds that other people have made. Some of them will blow your mind. Click the link in the description below and start building your world. And now, what you're here for. One quick word about our sponsor, World Anvil. Every DM should use World Anvil. Keep track of your players' characters, stats, gear, backgrounds, anything and everything with the digital DM screen. Roll dice, build random encounter tables, layer maps for your players to explore. Are you playing on Discord? Incorporate World Anvil into your game to allow your players to lose themselves in the amazing world you've created. Make articles secret that your players can unlock. Let them explore your world in between sessions. Use the session scheduler so no one misses a game. If you're a creator, writer, map maker, portrait artist, or fan of tabletop RPGs in general, you need to check out World Anvil. It's amazing. Click the link in the description below and build your world and share what you make with us. The worst D&D game I've ever played. Here's my tale of the single worst experience I've had playing D&D. Be warned, it's cringy and is probably nowhere near as bad as I think some of you would expect. The beginning. Our story begins in early 2015. When I was invited by a friend to fill a slot in one of his friend's D&D campaigns. I say friend. To be honest, this guy, who we shall call Bill, was more of an acquaintance who I talked to on occasion about tabletop gaming. 5e was relatively new at the time, and I hadn't really played D&D since 4th edition dropped, so I thought I'd give 5e a shot, and agreed to join this campaign. Bill was ecstatic, but he did give me a rather mysterious piece of advice. So, don't worry about buying any of the game manuals, but be sure to bring a blank character sheet and at least $50. He wouldn't elaborate on why I needed to bring $50, but maybe this DM friend was a paid DM? That was my reasoning at the time, and I wish I had grilled Bill on this further, because it would have saved me 2 months of pain. So a week or so later, I showed up at the address Bill gave me and rang the doorbell. I'm slightly late, but I have a blank character sheet, and I bought $100, as I thought I'd try and give a good first impression and have enough to cover for a player if they'd forgotten their fee. The door is answered by another of the players, who owned the house we were playing at. We'll call him Phil. Phil invites me in, shakes my hand, and brings me into the dining room where the other players are waiting. This is where the problems begin. So I'm introduced to the DM, who we'll call Bob. After the initial introductions are complete, Bob asks if I've played D&D before. I tell him that I've played 3e and 3.5e in the past, but haven't played 5e. Then he begins to run me through character creation. He hands me a copy of the PHB and tells me to flip through to find a class I think looks interesting. I settle on Paladin, then the Bombshell. Right, so that'll be $15 for the Paladin class. For a moment I'm convinced this is a practical joke of some sort. I look around. Bill looks apologetic, and Phil is trying not to make eye contact. The other player, who I'll call Arthur for the sake of naming everyone, although he doesn't really come into this story at all, is busy texting on his phone. I ask why Bob wants $15 to play a specific class. Oh, you weren't informed? Yeah, I treat all the overpowered classes as premium content. You have to pay to play them. I'm baffled. This is honestly where I should have quit, but there were two things that stopped me from walking away and excusing myself. First, I had spent an hour on the bus to get here. It was a 10-minute walk down the road to the bus stop back the way I came, and it was pouring with rain outside. 2, I didn't want to offend Bill, and since I enjoyed talking with him, I didn't want to ruin our semi-friendship. Finally, I reasoned that I could always play something else. Which classes do I not have to pay for? Turns out that the only 2 classes that Bob didn't require a deposit to play were the Fighter and the Beastmaster Ranger. Not knowing the system, I picked Beastmaster Ranger, upon which I was handed a pre-made character sheet. I asked why I was required to print out and bring a blank character sheet. Bob told me that he didn't have a printer, and so he needed people to bring character sheets so he could generate new characters if our old one dies. Later, Bill would explain that the $50 was in case I wanted to play one of the classes Bob priced higher, like Wizard or Sorcerer, both of which were around $40, and apologized for leaving me in the dark about these peculiarities. His excuse was that Bob had told him to be as vague as possible about the house rules, to avoid scaring off new players. I can honestly see why Bob would do something like that in retrospect. In any case, I was slightly annoyed that I wouldn't be getting taught about how to generate characters in a system I'd never played before, and that most of the class options weren't available without paying. But hey, maybe things would get better? Things do not get better. In fact, things got decidedly worse. The campaign we were playing was basic as hell. We were in a magical jungle filled with monsters, and we were just exploring. That's it. There were no towns, no NPCs to talk to, no way to buy new items, just random encounters, most of which were combat-based. It wasn't the worst experience as far as campaigns go. I actually enjoyed it at first. We'd decide where to go, we'd fill out a map with new terrain and stuff, and when we hit an encounter, there'd usually be something good to find. If you've played, say, an Elder Scrolls title or Bethesda-made Fallout game, this is basically what we were doing minus any questing. Most of the rewards we got were meager. For example, my first encounter with the group involved us defeating a horde of undead zombies in a ruined fort. It was pretty simple and we got a handful of silver coins, which we couldn't use because there were no vendors, a handful of basic non-magical weapons, a couple of healing potions, and some arrows. Now, I assumed at the time that this was to let a new player ease into the system, and to get a feel for the combat and gameplay. And true enough, this was a pretty good introduction to how to play the game. If I can give Bob credit for something, he was a pretty good encounter designer, and a lot of his encounters were pretty fun and unique. But when it came to rewarding us with XP, another problem came up. Bob had tallied up the XP, and it was time to dole it out. But then Phil pipes up with another bombshell. Hey, I want to double the XP for this encounter. Bob looks at something pinned to his DM screen. That'll be $5. That was pretty shocking. What was more shocking was that all of us had to give $5, or all of the XP would go to the people who paid money to double it. I was floored. This was about as scummy as you can get. But when I asked about this dumbfounded, it turned out that Bob had optional microtransactions for pretty much everything. Low on health? $2 and you're back to full. Out of arrows? Again, $2. Out of spell slots? $2 per level of slot per extended slot. Magic items weren't distributed based on which player needed them the most, but were instead auctioned off by Bob to whoever bid the highest. If you were playing a spellcaster, a large portion of spells were pay to learn. If you died, as in were downed, you didn't do death saves. Oh no, why would you do something like that? Instead, you have revival points, which you had 3 of when you created a character, and which you had to pay to get more of, or loot from encounters. Worst of all, if you failed a saving throw or ability skill check, you could pay more money to get a bonus to your roll that could possibly pass it. If Bob worked at EA or Activision Blizzard, he'd be an employee of the Millennium. Hell, he'd probably win some sort of promotion, or get put in charge of something. But fortunately for gamers worldwide, Bob was some sort of general manager, and probably hasn't gone into the game industry in the intervening 7 years since this game. And I was an idiot for not quitting once I found out all of this. The issue was that despite all of this being genuinely disgusting, I didn't quit the game and leave. Part of it was that I was somewhat invested in the gameplay of 5e, that had been left untouched by Bob and his shitty pay-to-win house rules. I still play 5e to this day, in spite of this awful first experience, because it's a genuinely fun RPG. Another part was that at this point in time, I had developed what I would definitely call a friendship with Bill, which, spoiler, didn't last, mainly due to me getting a job at another company and us falling out of contact. I didn't want to rock the boat, and I also didn't want to have to go and find an unfamiliar group of players to hang out with on Saturday afternoons. So I kept playing, trying to pay as little as possible while still enjoying the game. I still ended up paying a lot of money to play with this group, and while I can't give an exact number on how much, that $100 in my wallet was pretty much all gone by the 3rd session, and I was spending as little as humanly possible. The end. To cap this off, there really wasn't any sort of dramatic end brought on by Bob's terrible DMing. The game went on for about 8 sessions with me there, and then we sort of just drifted apart. People had work and family obligations. There were issues getting to the sessions, and eventually the game sort of went on hiatus and never came back. I don't miss it. Far from it. By that point, I'd figured out that I was going to have to get out of that game sooner rather than later, if I wanted to not have the hobby ruined for me. So it was fortuitous that I didn't have to make an exit that I would have felt guilty about later. But if there's one thing I can credit this sort of experience for, 2 months of my life and hundreds of dollars I will never be getting back, it's that it has made me extremely wary of microtransactions in non-tabletop games, and that I think has saved me from wasting a lot of money. I guess learning about the terrible nature that is microtransactions can be the silver lining of this story. What kind of monster adds microtransactions into role-playing? Tell us what you would do if someone tried to charge you for in-game perks. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, All Things D&D. Stay tuned for more amazing Dungeons & Dragons content.